It's early August, 2026, and I want to take you back to a moment that honestly tells you everything you need to know about how this entire standoff over the Strait of Hormuz actually works. Because Iran tried something back in the spring that was designed to make the United States Navy blink first, and instead it turned into one of the clearest demonstrations of resolve we've seen in this whole conflict. This is the story of what happened when two American destroyers pushed straight into the most contested waterway on the planet, when the IRGC got on the radio and issued what they called the last warning, and when Washington's answer to that threat wasn't retreat, it was to turn on the lights and let the whole world watch them sail through anyway. And the reason this moment matters right now, months later, is because Iran is still trying the exact same play today, which tells you they never actually learned the lesson the first time around. Let's set the scene properly, because the details here matter enormously. Back on April 11th, two Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Michael Murphy and the USS Frank E. Petersen Jr., pushed into the Strait of Hormuz as part of a CENTCOM mission to begin clearing sea mines that Iran's Revolutionary Guard had planted throughout the waterway. This wasn't some symbolic drive-by. This was two of the most capable surface combatants in the entire American fleet, ships built specifically for missile defense, strike warfare, and command presence, moving directly into water that Iran had spent weeks declaring off limits to anyone without Tehran's personal permission. And almost immediately, the IRGC got on the radio. A recording later obtained by outlets covering the standoff captured the exchange in real time, with the Iranian operator repeating the same phrase over and over, "This is the last warning. This is the last warning," as if repetition alone was going to be enough to turn two American warships around. And here's how the American side responded: calm, measured, almost bureaucratic in its restraint. Passage in accordance with international law. No challenges intended to you, and I intend to abide by the rules of our government's ceasefire. That's it. No escalation in tone, no matching threat for threat, just a simple statement of fact delivered over open radio while the ship kept moving forward exactly as planned. Now here's the detail that really tells you how deliberate this entire moment was. As the destroyers crossed through the strait, the USS Michael Murphy turned on its automatic identification system, the transponder that broadcasts a ship's location to anyone tracking maritime traffic. Normally, Navy ships operating in a contested or sensitive waters run with that system switched off entirely. For obvious operational security reasons, you don't want to be broadcasting your exact position to a country that's been threatening to target you. But this time, the destroyers flipped it on, specifically on the far side of the strait, specifically so that anyone watching maritime tracking data anywhere in the world could see in real time that these two American ships had made it all the way through. Naval historians who study exactly this kind of signaling were blunt about what that meant. You don't just accidentally turn AIS on aboard a Navy warship. That's a deliberate choice, a very public way of saying, we came through and we're not hiding that we did it. So before we go any further, if you're finding this breakdown interesting so far, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think Iran's actual goal was with that radio warning, and subscribe, because there's a lot more to this story than just one radio exchange, and I want to walk you through exactly how it played out from here. Now let's talk about what happened next, because this is where the story splits into two completely different versions depending on who you ask. And that split tells you almost everything about how this entire information war is being fought alongside the actual military one. Iranian state media put out their own account almost immediately, claiming the destroyers had attempted what they called a high-risk stunt, timed specifically to influence talks that were happening in Islamabad at the time, and that Iranian patrol forces operating near Fujairah detected the ships early, despite what Tehran claimed was an attempt at electronic deception, allegedly trying to disguise themselves as ordinary commercial traffic linked to Oman by hugging the coastline and running through shallower water. According to that version of events, the destroyers were intercepted, forced to retreat, and never actually completed the transit at all. A follow-up piece from Iranian state broadcasting went even further, claiming an investigation based on unnamed military and security sources revealed the American ships had come within. And this is a direct claim from their own reporting. Minutes of complete destruction. Now, let's just sit with that claim for a second, because it's worth actually thinking through rather than just repeating. If American destroyers really came within minutes of being destroyed in the Strait of Hormuz, that would be one of the most significant military escalations of the entire 21st century. An actual armed clash between American and Iranian forces with American warships nearly sunk. And yet, in the exact same breath, Iranian sources are also claiming those ships never even completed the passage, that they turned around and fled. Those two claims cannot both be true at the same time. If the destroyers were forced to retreat before completing the transit, then they were never actually in the position of nearly being destroyed mid-passage in the way the more dramatic version of the story suggests. It's the kind of contradiction that shows up constantly in wartime propaganda, where the goal isn't necessarily internal consistency. It's just producing enough dramatic, defiant-sounding content to keep domestic morale up and to make the other side look reckless and humiliated, even if the actual details don't hold together under any real scrutiny. Compare that to the American account and to the actual physical evidence available to anyone tracking commercial shipping data. The destroyers turned their identification system on specifically to demonstrate they had completed the crossing. Central Command's own statements described the mission as setting conditions for mine clearance operations, a mission that continued in the weeks and months that followed, with the same two ships repeatedly cited as operating in the strait well beyond that single April encounter. If those ships had genuinely been chased off or nearly destroyed, it's difficult to explain why they kept showing up in the exact same waterway, doing the exact same job for months afterward. The far more coherent explanation, and the one that lines up with the actual evidence, is that Iran issued a threat over the radio. The United States Navy politely declined to take that threat seriously, completed its mission, and then Iranian state media spun the entire encounter into a story about American humiliation because admitting the alternative, that their warning simply didn't work, would have been a much harder story to tell their own domestic audience. And here's the thing that makes this whole episode even more revealing. This wasn't even a one-time encounter. The exact same phrase, "This is the last warning," got broadcast again months later, on June 15th, the very same day the United States and Iran actually signed a memorandum of understanding meant to formally end the broader conflict. Once again, it was directed at the USS Frank E. Petersen Jr. during ongoing mine clearance work in the Strait. Once again, Iranian state media released footage of an IRGC serviceman ordering the destroyer to alter course and head back to the Indian Ocean, or be targeted. And once again, the American response was almost word for word identical to the one delivered back in April. Passage in accordance with international law, no challenge intended, abiding by the rules of the ceasefire. Think about what it means that Iran used the literal same script twice, months apart, on a day that was supposed to represent the formal resolution of hostilities. That's not the behavior of a military command that's confident in its actual leverage. That's the behavior of a force that found one line that sounded tough enough to broadcast to its own population, and kept reusing it because the underlying reality that American ships kept moving through the strait regardless never actually changed. Let's talk about what these two destroyers actually represent from a technical standpoint, because it helps explain exactly why the IRGC's radio threats never had much of a chance of actually stopping this mission. The Arleigh Burke-class is the backbone of the entire American surface fleet, and each of these ships is built around the Aegis combat system, a networked radar and missile defense architecture capable of tracking dozens of airborne, surface, and subsurface threats simultaneously while coordinating a response in seconds. These aren't lightly armed patrol boats. Each destroyer carries a vertical launch system loaded with dozens of missile cells, capable of everything from area air defense to long-range strike missions, plus a 5-inch deck gun, torpedoes, and close-in weapon systems designed specifically to shred incoming small boats or drones before they ever get close enough to matter. When an IRGC operator gets on the radio and threatens to target a ship like that, they're threatening a platform that was purpose-built by the world's most capable navy specifically to survive and dominate exactly this kind of contested, congested waterway. That doesn't mean the threat is completely empty. Iran's coastal defenses and fast boat swarms have caused real damage to commercial shipping throughout this conflict, but it does mean the gap between what Iran's navy can credibly threaten and what these two destroyers were actually built to withstand is enormous, and everyone involved in that radio exchange almost certainly understood that gap in real time. It's also worth understanding Iran's side of this equation a little more honestly, because dismissing their doctrine entirely would be a mistake. Iran has never tried to build a navy that can go toe-to-toe with American destroyers in a conventional sense, and they know that. Instead, for decades, their entire coastal strategy has revolved around asymmetric harassment, swarms of small, fast, cheap attack boats, hidden anti-ship missile batteries tucked into coastal hillsides, mines laid quietly at night, and the constant threat of a lucky shot landing somewhere it shouldn't. That doctrine has actually worked reasonably well for Iran in the past, going all the way back to encounters during the so-called tanker war decades ago, and more recently in a string of incidents where IRGC speedboats harassed American vessels closely enough to force a change in operational posture, including one widely publicized episode where Iranian boats reportedly forced the American helicopter carrier to ground its aircraft rather than risk a mid-air incident in contested airspace. So when Iran threatens a destroyer over the radio, it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from a long institutional memory of moments where exactly this kind of aggressive posturing actually did change American behavior in the moment. The difference this time, and it's a significant difference, is the broader military context. Those earlier incidents happened outside of active, sustained combat when nobody wanted an isolated harassment incident to spiral into a full-blown war. This time, the war had already started months earlier. The coastal missile batteries Iran would need to make good on that threat had already been targeted repeatedly by American airstrikes. The fast boat squadrons that used to be able to swarm effectively had already taken losses. Iran was reaching for a tactic built for a peacetime standoff and trying to apply it in the middle of an active war, where the underlying capability behind the threat had already been substantially worn down. Let's talk about why the mine clearance mission itself matters so much here, because it's easy to get caught up in the drama of the radio exchange and lose track of what these ships were actually there to do. Iran had spent weeks seeding portions of the strait with naval mines specifically to make the waterway too dangerous for anyone to use without going through Tehran. That's the entire foundation of Iran's leverage in this conflict, not because their navy could actually win a direct engagement with American destroyers, but because the mere presence of hidden mines makes every single commercial vessel captain think twice before attempting a transit, regardless of what any warship escort might be able to do to protect them. So when American destroyers moved in specifically to begin clearing that minefield, they weren't just making a symbolic show of force, they were attacking the actual physical mechanism underpinning Iran's entire strategy. And that's exactly why Iran needed to be seen responding forcefully, even if that response amounted to nothing more than a strongly worded radio transmission. If Iran let American mine clearance operations proceed without so much as a public objection, it would have been an admission that they'd essentially lost control of their own leverage without a fight. But here's the honesty check, because even months later, the mine clearance situation itself tells a complicated story. Secretary of State Rubio publicly confirmed that Iran had mined large segments of the strait, and reporting from that same period indicated those segments remained mined even after the formal memorandum of understanding was signed in June. There were reports of an Allied fleet staged and ready, sitting within days of the operational zone, specifically to accelerate the clearance effort, waiting on authorization that reportedly didn't come as quickly as some in the coalition wanted. So this isn't a story where the mine threat got neatly resolved the moment those two destroyers pushed through in April. It's a much messier, slower grind than that, one where the political theater of a signed agreement moved faster than the actual physical work of clearing explosive devices out of one of the busiest waterways in the world. Oil prices reportedly moved in the wrong direction the same day that agreement was signed, which tells you traders themselves weren't fully convinced the underlying danger had actually gone away just because officials shook hands in a ceremony. If you're new to this story and trying to piece together how we got from that April standoff to where things stand today, this is exactly the kind of moment worth subscribing for, because these individual confrontations connect into a much bigger pattern once you start tracking them over time. Let's also talk about the information war piece of this a little more, because Press TV and Iran's other state outlets didn't just get one detail wrong in their coverage of the April encounter. They built an entire narrative structure around a claim that falls apart under basic scrutiny. And that pattern is worth understanding because you're going to keep seeing it every single time one of these confrontations happens. State media in an authoritarian system doesn't need its story to survive independent fact-checking. It needs its story to survive exactly one news cycle inside its own information bubble, where alternative sources are heavily restricted and the domestic audience has very limited ability to cross-reference the claims against outside reporting. So you get a story that simultaneously claims American destroyers were forced to retreat without completing their mission, and also claims those same destroyers came within minutes of complete destruction, two claims that logically cannot both be true, published within the same investigative piece by the same outlet, without any apparent internal concern about the contradiction. That's not sloppy journalism, that's a specific kind of wartime propaganda where the emotional impact of the claim matters far more than its internal consistency. Because the goal isn't to convince a skeptical international audience, it's to give a domestic population something dramatic and defiant to hold on to, regardless of what actually happened out on the water that day. And this is exactly why independent verification matters so much in a conflict like this one. The recording of the actual radio exchange wasn't released by the American military trying to spin a favorable narrative. It was captured by a civilian ship in the area and later shared with journalists, giving us a version of events that exists outside of either government's official messaging. That's the version that lines up cleanly with everything else we can independently verify. The AIS data showing the ships crossed the strait, the continued mine clearance operations involving the exact same vessels for months afterward, and the near-identical confrontation that played out again in June with the same script, the same threat, and the same measured American response. When you have multiple independent data points all pointing the same direction, and only one heavily state-controlled outlet telling a dramatically different story riddled with internal contradictions, it's not exactly a difficult call which version of events deserves more weight. Let's talk about the human element of all this too. Because even a standoff that ends without a shot being fired still carries real risk and real weight for the people involved. Every sailor aboard those destroyers that day was operating in a stretch of water that had already seen mines laid, missiles fired, and small boat attacks launched against other vessels throughout this conflict. A radio threat might sound like just words on a recording when you're listening to it months later, but in the moment, for the crew actually standing watch on deck, that kind of warning carries the very real possibility that the next few seconds could turn into an actual engagement. The fact that both crossings ended without violence doesn't mean the risk wasn't genuine. It means the restraint and professionalism on both sides, at least in that specific moment, kept a tense standoff from turning into something far worse. That's worth acknowledging, because it would have been remarkably easy for a nervous IRGC gunner or a startled American sailor to turn a war of words into an actual firefight, and the broader region, along with the global economy that depends on that strait staying open, would have felt the consequences of that mistake almost immediately. Let's fast forward to where things stand right now, because remarkably, we're still watching almost the exact same dynamic play out. Just this past week, a senior military advisor to Iran's supreme leader went on state television and delivered language that could have been lifted directly from that April radio transmission. He said Iran will not allow any shipments through the strait except along the specific route Tehran has designated, and explicitly warned that American warships attempting to use any other route will be targeted. He went further, saying there will certainly be serious dangers to American ships and bases, and that Iran will not simply sit and watch the naval blockade continue. That's essentially the same threat, delivered by essentially the same kind of official, using essentially the same language, months after the first version of this threat demonstrably failed to change American behavior in any meaningful way. And in the middle of all that renewed rhetoric, shipping analysts tracking actual vessel movement through the strait have noted that only a small handful of ships, often fewer than 10 a day, are currently making the transit. A much more cautious picture than the more optimistic tone coming from some American officials who've suggested a full return to normal traffic could be just around the corner. That gap between official optimism and the actual cautious behavior of commercial shipping companies is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how differently each side experiences risk in this situation. A government spokesperson can afford to sound confident about an imminent deal. A shipping company deciding whether to send a multi-hundred-million-dollar tanker through water that's been mined, threatened, and repeatedly the site of tense military standoffs has a much higher bar for what actually counts as safe. The destroyers proved they could push through despite Iranian threats. That doesn't mean every commercial captain in the world is suddenly convinced the danger has passed, and honestly, given everything we've just walked through, that caution looks pretty reasonable. Let's talk about what this entire pattern actually reveals about Iran's broader strategy. Because once you see it repeated 3 separate times, in April, in June, and again just this week in August, it stops looking like a series of isolated incidents and starts looking like a deliberate, if increasingly hollow, playbook. Iran's actual military capability to genuinely stop an American destroyer from transiting the strait has been degraded significantly over months of sustained strikes on coastal missile batteries, radar installations, and fast attack boat squadrons. What Iran still has, in abundance, is the ability to get on the radio and sound threatening, and the ability to control the domestic media narrative afterward, regardless of what actually happened out on the water. That's an incredibly cheap strategy to run. It costs nothing to broadcast a warning. It costs nothing to release a dramatically worded state media story afterward, claiming victory or claiming the enemy narrowly avoided destruction. The only thing that strategy requires is that nobody closely compares the rhetoric to the actual outcome. And that's exactly why walking through the details, the way we just did, matters so much. The moment you line up what Iran claimed against what actually happened, the pattern collapses under its own weight almost every single time. And there's a deeper point buried in here about how modern military confrontations actually get won or lost. Because it's not always about who fires the first shot or who has the bigger fleet. Sometimes it's about who blinks first, in a moment specifically designed to test resolve. Iran built an entire radio transmission, twice, around the phrase, "This is the last warning," precisely because that kind of language is meant to provoke hesitation. It's meant to make a ship's captain pause, radio back up the chain of command, second-guess the mission, maybe even turn around just to be safe. And every single time, the recorded response from the American side stayed exactly the same. Calm, factual, unbothered, and the ships kept moving. That consistency itself sends its own message, arguably a louder one than any single missile strike could. It tells Iran, and it tells every other actor watching this conflict unfold from the sidelines, that threats alone, without the actual capability or willingness to follow through, don't change American naval posture in this region. Let's also talk briefly about what this means for the broader diplomatic track, because these confrontations aren't happening in a vacuum separate from the talks that have been ongoing on and off for months. The April standoff happened specifically while ceasefire discussions were underway in Islamabad. The June repeat happened on the exact day a memorandum of understanding was formally signed. And the renewed threats we're hearing right now are happening while Iran is simultaneously engaged in talks with Oman over establishing safe shipping corridors. And while officials in Doha describe draft agreements between Washington and Tehran as being in what they call very progressive stages. So every single one of these radio confrontations has landed at a moment when diplomacy was actively happening in parallel, which strongly suggests these aren't accidents of timing. They look a lot more like Iran trying to demonstrate continued strength and continued control at exactly the moments when their negotiating leverage might otherwise look weakest. A kind of parallel signaling track running alongside the actual diplomatic one, aimed as much at Iran's own domestic audience and its own military hardliners as it is at Washington. That last point matters more than it might seem at first glance, because, remember, there's a real and consistently reported tension inside Iran's own government between the political leadership trying to manage this crisis through negotiation and the IRGC's naval commanders, who've built their entire institutional identity around controlling that waterway. Every time a political process moves forward, whether it's ceasefire talks or a signed memorandum, the IRGC has a clear incentive to demonstrate publicly that they haven't actually given up any ground, that the political leadership hasn't simply handed the strait over to American control just to get a deal done. Broadcasting a dramatic last warning over the radio, and then immediately following it up with triumphant state media coverage regardless of what actually happened, is a remarkably efficient way to send that message internally without ever having to risk an actual military engagement that Iran's degraded coastal forces would very likely lose. So where does all of this leave us right now, sitting here in early August with Iran once again threatening to target American warships over the exact same disputed routes through the exact same strait? Based on everything we've just walked through, the most likely outcome is that this plays out almost exactly the way it has twice before. American forces will very likely continue operating according to what they consider international law, mine clearance, work will continue, and if another radio confrontation happens, the response will probably sound remarkably similar to the two we already have on record. Iranian state media will probably frame whatever happens as some form of victory or as evidence of American recklessness narrowly avoided, regardless of what the actual outcome on the water looks like. And commercial shipping companies, the people with the most real skin in the game and the least incentive to spin the story one way or another, will keep making their own quiet, cautious calculations about which routes are actually worth the risk, largely independent of whatever rhetoric either government puts out that week. What makes this story genuinely worth paying attention to isn't just the drama of a single radio exchange, dramatic as that moment clearly was. It's what that exchange, repeated now on multiple separate occasions, tells you about the actual balance of power in the Strait of Hormuz beneath all the noise. Threats that don't change behavior aren't leverage, they're theater. And the fact that Iran has had to keep reaching for the exact same script, months apart, against the exact same ships doing the exact same job, tells you that whatever leverage they once had over that waterway has been steadily, consistently eroding, no matter how loud the warnings coming out of Tehran continue to sound. There's also an important allied dimension to this story that doesn't get nearly enough attention because the United States hasn't been navigating this standoff entirely alone. Other nations with a direct economic stake in the strait staying open, including European partners who sent their own minesweeping assets toward the region, have been watching these confrontations just as closely as Washington has. Every time an American destroyer completes a transit despite an Iranian threat, it reinforces the broader international position that this waterway is governed by international law and open passage, rather than by whichever regional power happens to have mined it most recently. That's not just an American talking point. It's a principle that countries far removed from this specific conflict, ones that depend on Gulf oil and gas reaching their own ports, have a direct interest in seeing upheld. So when Iran frames these confrontations purely as a bilateral test of wills between Tehran and Washington, it somewhat understates the actual audience watching. Every shipping nation with tankers that need to move through that 21-mile gap is quietly keeping score too. And every time the American response holds steady under pressure, it's not just American resolve being demonstrated, it's the broader international consensus around freedom of navigation being reinforced right alongside it. It's worth also thinking about what a genuinely different outcome would have looked like, because the counterfactual actually clarifies why this moment mattered so much. Imagine, for a second, that the American destroyers had actually turned around back in April, that the first last warning had actually worked. That single decision would have handed Iran an enormous propaganda victory at almost no cost to them. Proof, in their own telling, that even after months of losing ground militarily along the coast, they could still dictate terms to the most powerful navy on Earth with nothing more than a radio transmission. Every subsequent transit attempt would have carried the shadow of that precedent. Commercial shipping companies would have had even less confidence that any American escort or mine clearance effort could actually be trusted to hold under pressure. And Iran's own hardliners, the ones skeptical of any diplomatic process to begin with, would have had exactly the evidence they needed to argue that aggression, not negotiation, was still the winning strategy. None of that happened, specifically because the destroyers kept moving, and that single choice in the moment ended up mattering a lot more than a single radio exchange might have seemed to at the time. Sometimes the most consequential decisions in a conflict like this one aren't the dramatic missile strikes that dominate headlines for a day. They're the quiet, almost boring choices to simply keep doing the job as planned, even when someone on the other end of a radio is doing everything they can to make you think twice. Let me know what you think happens the next time Iran tries this exact same move. Because based on the pattern we've now seen play out 3 separate times, it's hard to imagine the outcome looking much different from what we've already watched unfold. Drop your thoughts down in the comments, share this with anyone trying to understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines in the Gulf right now, and subscribe so you don't miss the next update in this story. Because if history here is any guide, this almost certainly won't be the last time somebody in Tehran gets on the radio and calls it the last warning.